That's if a doctor would see it, they would be amazed if you keep your values between, say, 80, 90, and 120.
How did you find the carnivore diet?
I'm a type 1 diabetic. I've been that for about, I think, for my late 20s, so probably for about 15 years. But leading up to that, I experienced a lot of other issues. One big one, that's what it started with, actually, in my mind at least. So the first thing that I realized that I suffered from was celiac disease. So I went on a gluten-free diet that helped a lot. And as some people might know, but it's not very well known, but the celiac disease and type 1 diabetics genetically related. So if you have one of the two, then it's also likely that you'll have the other one. That happened to me as well. But okay, getting back to your question, so how did I discover the carnivore diet? That was a much shorter road. So it still took about half a year, I think. So about 1.5 years ago, or actually a little bit less, September 2022, experienced a lot of troubles in regulating my type 1 diabetes, because with type 1 diabetes, you have to do a lot more than just looking at your diet, reducing the carbohydrates. You have to deal with insulin, and basically you have to mimic the function of your pancreas, producing the insulin, with all kinds of factors that you cannot control as well as the original organ. But I experienced a lot of troubles in daily life. It was really disturbing my practical daily life, so both physically and mentally. That was really disturbing. For me, that was so critical at some point that I started to look into how to deal with that. Well, actually, I was looking at those things for much longer time, and that was quite frustrating, actually. So at first, I was following standard medical advice. So I was not. So nowadays, they don't really advise to carb load as a diabetic patient. But still, they will say you can easily eat, say, 200 or 300 grams of carbs per day. When there is a birthday, you can still eat a piece of cake. And then you compensate with it, with this fake pancreas, because you are going to inject your insulin with an insulin pen or an insulin pump, which has a lot of uncertainties in it. So they say you can compensate your piece of cake. So a piece of cake would be, I don't know, 60 grams of carbs. You can compensate with it by injecting more insulin, and you can calculate that exactly. So if it's 60 grams, you will give, for the sake of simplicity, you will give 6 units of insulin. If it's 70 grams, you give 7 units of insulin. Well, there it already goes wrong, because well, if you look at the package, if you look at the nutritional values of things that you find in the supermarkets, well, the calories already, I think they allow for a margin of, I don't know, 5, 10, or maybe even 20%. So that cannot be known for sure how much you are actually consuming. Then the piece of cake, well, there are some healthy macronutrients in the piece of cake. So there are proteins and fats, and they slow down the absorption of carbs to some degree, because the piece of cake, I think you can add as much fat as you want, but in the end it contains basic sucrose. So half of it is glucose, and will be, no matter how much fat you will add to it, it will be absorbed very quickly. But still, there is this part of the meal also that if it contains more fat, then the absorption will be very different. So you will have to account for that in your insulin, because otherwise you will suddenly have hypoglycemic episodes, and you will start to be shaking, and you have to sit down and eat extra sugar, and then your sugar will rise up sky high again, especially if you follow standard recommendations again, because doctors fear hypoglycemic episodes because they are acute problems. If something goes wrong, you are really flat on the ground. Unlike high sugars, which you can experience for days or weeks or years even, without having acute problems, but of course, in the end, more severe problems will result with like feet are being amputated, that sort of things. But anyway, then if you follow that approach, you will experience this what people refer to as this roller coaster, and that's really disturbing in daily life. You could compare it with having the munchies. Think if you have low sugar, you have that in quadratic form. So you are really shaking. You have to eat something, so you can also not control with your mind how much you will be eating, because maybe in theory you will need 1 tablet of sugar to correct for the glycemic in your blood, but you will take much more because your instinct says that you have to correct for it. So there will be adrenaline and that sort of things going through your system. Yeah, that's the typical thing that I experienced in daily life, and actually, maybe in a way that was the most severe problem is the mental aspect. So the fact that you are trying to do everything correctly. So with all the knowledge that you have, you are thinking like I'm measuring how much I'm eating, I'm measuring how much I'm injecting, and then still things go wrong at least 50% of the time. And that has to do with all the uncertainties. So there are, I think, maybe hundreds of them. So just to name a few is, we talked about the variety and uncertainty in ingredients in the food and how it's absorbed. Well, the same holds for the insulin. So I think maybe, I don't know, 50 or 60 years ago, they first invented insulin, or they found a way to reproduce human insulin. And, before that, they for some time used pork insulin, I think. And before that, there was no insulin. So the only actual way to solve type 1 diabetes, well, there was none, because in the long term you would simply not survive it. But in the relatively short term, you could survive for some time by basically following a ketogenic diet. So that was actually, say, in the beginning of the 20th century. But so there are a lot of uncertainties in insulin, because, well, we started with pork insulin, which you can imagine, so I'm not an expert on that, but it will work slightly differently. Then we went to more human type of insulins, but there is also a lot of variation in those insulins. And that means also that the absorption rate is very different. But even when using the same insulin, if you inject it with a pen, you're injecting it in your subcutaneous tissue. And already, depending on how you inject it, whether you massage the skin, the temperature, the type of insulin, of course, maybe even if the insulin is 1 week old, or it has been out of the fridge for 3 weeks, or you make a mistake and it's maybe already 2 months old for some reason, it will all have an effect. And in some cases, insulin can also build up in local places under the skin and then arrive much later. So you can get all kinds of effects, like your sugar going down or up.
That's a crazy number of variables.
Yes, and we're talking just about injecting the insulin.
And this is every day.
Yeah. But then there are a lot of variables that also type 2 diabetics or also healthy people know about: stress, sleep. The obvious one is exercise. So exercise can also do both. So it can increase the sensitivity of your insulin, but at the same time, it can also make your body release glycogen. And so your sugar levels can rise if you're doing very intense exercise. So long-term slow exercise is very good at reducing insulin and glucose levels, but intense exercise can do the opposite as well. Well, it's still healthy, of course, because your sugars in a healthy person would drop again. That's a thing to account for. And then going back shortly to the insulin, I'm using an insulin pump actually. Some people even connect it with automatic systems to the glucose monitor. But there is a lot of sensitivity as well, especially if you would use this automatic system, because, well, it has been thought up by humans. It's not a system like the original organ again, because the original organ can measure, I don't know how it works exactly, but it will compensate the insulin based on the actual glucose levels in real time in the blood, while the glucose sensors that some of us use as well, they measure again in subcutaneous tissue, and that's a good thing actually for carnivores and keto people to know. If you use those devices, they are only giving an indication of what's happening. So there is a delay, again, the sensitivity. So there's a 10 minutes, 15 minutes delay. But also, if I'm sitting still, my glucose might be, so to go to milligrams per deciliters, might be, say, 90 or 100 when I'm sitting still. So this sensor is actually over here in my arm. But if then I start to just move my arm a little bit, there's a lot of things happening in the subcutaneous tissue, apparently. It's quite close to the muscles. I think that's the reason. And there will be activated some muscles a bit more, and your glucose will rise in your subcutaneous tissue. While in the blood, it might be still okay. So if I measure on my fingers here with the typical finger prick device, I might see that my glucose stays the same, sort of, in the blood. But the continuous glucose monitor will even say that my sugar goes to 140 in some cases. Or it might give some, that's another thing, you have to calibrate it. So it might give much higher values to start with. So that's again a lot of control factors that are unclear. And that's frustrating, of course, because it's, yeah, to me, it sounds like there's some small devil sitting on my shoulder, is looking at how I'm doing. And every time it's thinking of something new that can go wrong. So also things like the insulin pump that has a Bluetooth connection with the glucose monitor, for example. What happens is that this Bluetooth connection might break down for some time, that the phone doesn't receive a signal. And you'll see exactly at those times, if you're missing your glucose measurements for half an hour or 1 hour, what happens? That's exactly the moment that there was something wrong with your injection site and your sugar goes up. That sort of things. And you cannot deal with that.
Yeah, it just seems you constantly have to be thinking about this, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
just sounds, it just seems like it would be exhausting.
Yes, yeah, and I think uh, mostly mentally, because I think physically, well, I already didn't eat a very high carb diet, but still standard diet with bread and that sort of things. But I was able to reasonably control it physical level. So I might experience also some high sugar levels, but that on itself, maybe at the moment itself, does not necessarily mean that your daily patterns are disturbed. But still, if you see those measurements on your device, and and you look at the effects of build-up effects, if you have that several times per week, then at the end of the week you will be somewhat more tired, and you will also have this frustration that you experience all those high sugars and you could not deal with that, knowing that in the long term that will have consequences.
So you were struggling to control the blood sugar in September last year.
Yeah.
And so what did you do at that point?
Yes, so that's indeed where I wanted to go, the sugar control. So you have all these uncertainties. I wanted to deal with that. September 2022, I started looking on YouTube and on the internet in general, at forums and that sort of things, to deal with sugar control. So I looked at that in the past and found all these standard solutions, and suggestion of not eating too many carbs is quite common, of course. But then I came across the type 1 grid groups. That is a group of people on Facebook. I think it's located at a children's hospital or something like that. But there were a lot of people, parents, working with their children, following a low-carb diet. And there I also came across the name of Dr. Bernstein. He wrote a book called The Diabetes Solution. And that's all about following a low-carb approach. And the reasoning behind that is that you follow a law of small numbers. So when you have all these uncertainties, you can do two things. You can go high carb, and your uncertainties will be large because you will have to inject also fast and a lot of fast insulin. And you can follow a low carb approach. Then you will have low amounts of insulin. And low carb means also that you're eating a lot of proteins and fats. So also the absorption will be slow again. So both in time and quantity, you will have what Bernstein refers to as the law of small numbers. So you will get a lot of more control of what's happening. And you will get not a roller coaster, but a very smooth landscape in terms of glucose measurements. And that worked. So I followed this low carb approach or medium carb approach. I think he goes for 50 grams per day or less. And in terms of glucose control, the effect is basically immediate. And intuitively, I already went for this approach sometimes, but as most people, I was scared about following a truly low carb or zero carb approach because, well, in my mind, also doing extreme things in diet could not be healthy. Yeah? So carbs, they are there for some reason. So I have to eat them still. And that's also how I progressed in following the keto and low carb diets, because I started indeed with, say, 50 grams per day. So I would still eat maybe fruit like berries and all that sort of things, and it would easily add up to 40, 50 grams. And talking about it with other people, with family members or other people that I know, I really talked in this way as well. So I will go very gradually, and I will never go carnivore or keto. Also, keto for me was still a dirty word because I would always think of these people that you would find on television media or on YouTube that are doing crazy diets. So keto for me was a very dirty word. But in practice, I was gradually reducing carbohydrates even more. So I was basically doing keto at some point, I think 1 month later or so. And glucose control stayed good. Also, I was feeling very well, so I continued. because that's how I think about it. If I'm feeling well, let's continue at least for some time.
And so at this point, like what is the difference in your day when you're thinking about, controlling your insulin?
Yes, so what a lot of high carb people do on treating type 1 diabetes or type 2 as well. So you would eat this piece of cake and then use your glucose monitor and see that your sugars will rise sky high, and then at that point you will correct for it with insulin. And to some degree, that's better than doing nothing, of course. But the nice thing, now that I'm not eating those things, so if you are eating those things, you would have to think about it. So if you're going to eat a piece of cake, then at least inject your fast-acting insulin, say half an hour before you eat the cake. Because then the insulin is absorbed, and exactly at the moment that you eat the cake, that it enters your bloodstream, then the insulin is active. But yeah, that's a lot of thinking, and you would do things a priori. So and get bad results if you do it otherwise. Now on the low carb approach, I can actually do things posteriori, and still get good results. So if I'm eating, say, a piece of steak, then my sugar levels rise gradually. It can, well, the first rise, so there's the first part that is absorbed, say, within an hour or so, but it goes very gradually. And I can look basically at my glucose monitor and correct afterwards. I will not do that because I will still, most of the times, try to do it at forehand and get even better results. But if I do it afterwards, my sugar levels will still remain, say, below 120 milligrams per deciliter. So that's for a type 1 diabetic, that if a doctor would see it, they would be amazed if you keep your values between, say, 80, 90, and 120. And so then there is the part, the steak will be digested in the first hour partly, but then there's also the part that takes about 3, 4, or 5 or 6 hours. So that's also the reason why they say that you shouldn't eat, say, later than 3 to 4 hours before sleeping, because if you do, the steak is digested during your sleep, and your digestive system will be active. You're sleeping badly. Your body temperature might be warmer, actually. That sort of things. But that part is also very easy to regulate, that digestive part, because your glucose levels will rise very slowly still. So you can use very slow acting insulin, and the quantity is not that much. So normally you would say use 5 units of insulin for a piece of cake. Now I'm using those same 5 units, 4 or 5 units, for my big carnivore meal of, say, 1 or 1.5 pound of meat. But those 5 units are spread across, say, 5 hours as well. So there you see the law of small numbers coming up again. Basically, if you make any mistake, then the consequences are not that bad, because if you compare, I think it was Sean Baker, he gave an example of doing intense exercise, and well, he's just a normal, healthy person in terms of insulin and metabolic health. And doing so, his sugar levels might also rise shortly. Yeah, so, and I've heard more examples of that. If you do intense exercise, your sugar levels can even go up to 140 for some short amount of time. And that I also learned to look at it in that way, that your sugar levels in general should be stable. They should not have too much variation, too much fluctuation in time. That's a healthy thing. And they should not remain high all of the time. But if there are short episodes of, say, 15, 30 minutes, that your sugar level is at 140, something like that, or if it's a little bit low as well, then that's not really an issue. And I suspect that also health consequences in the long term are virtually absent in that case. Cannot be sure, of course, because that's an interesting aspect of insulin as well. It's what people always refer to as this key to open the door of the body cells to let the glucose in. And that's also how we look at it principally in terms of diabetic patients control. But insulin is doing a lot more. So if you look at the research of Ben Bigman, so he wrote some interesting books on that as well. Insulin plays a role basically in a lot of processes in the human body. I think virtually every cell depends on it, but depends on it in a lot more ways than just uptaking the glucose from the blood. So diseases like this polycystic ovary syndrome have to deal with insulin resistance. The way I understand it, and I might be wrong, but I think it's a good way to look at it anyway. If you are insulin resistant, then the first trouble that you will see is your glucose control. And we're going to compensate for that, both type 2 diabetics and type 1 diabetics, by injecting more insulin, or taking metformin, for example. But then we are not looking at all those other processes because, well, we have some idea of how they work, but we don't know all the details. I think in the last few decades we are learning a lot, of course, but we don't know exactly how everything works. So we're messing with the insulin, and probably, well, especially with type 2 diabetics, we're doing a good job, I think. But in type 1 diabetes, the only thing that I can look at, because my insulin sensitivity is good, but I basically don't produce it. So the only thing I can look at is the glucose levels. But I cannot grasp all the effects of and all the needs of the other processes. So I might still be affecting other processes that I'm of course mimicking this pancreas, and I can mimic, say, the glucose control very well, but I have no idea if I'm still damaging systems that rely on insulin in a different way.
So you're kind of talking about the potential fallout of you're fixing this or controlling this, but what are the consequences of doing that? Because it's kind of artificial what you're doing, right?
Indeed, and there's also some interesting research. I would have to look it up to get the references, but I read about it at some point. Is that in type 2 diabetes patients, it was not always beneficial to increase the glucose control. So if you would look at the glucose levels and you get better H1Cs, it could actually mean that you have to do more with taking medicines and you have to take more or less insulin. But apparently that doesn't mean that that's beneficial for your system, because probably what happens is that you will be using more insulin, and that's also not a good thing. So more insulin, of course, means that you are less sensitive to insulin, and insulin itself, that's what I understood, also is not good for your system in large quantities. So just on itself, it's bad, and not only in terms of insulin sensitivity, but just on itself. And that's quite surprising. That this research shows that better glucose control is not beneficial. So I think the comparison was between A1Cs of 7 and 6%. So in both cases, not a really ideal glucose control, because it should be below 5.5. Another factor that could still play a role here, of course, is that these are average values, so 3 months averages. But still, they were talking about better glucose control, so also in a continuous sense. So that's quite surprising that this, maybe it's not surprising, but it's interesting that this classical approach is not necessarily the perfect solution yet.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's another aspect of diabetes research. So I mentioned this A1Cs of 7 and 6, but the typical research is also, as you see in more fields, is that it's based on patients that don't have perfect control. So all these researches are done on people with 7 and 6 A1Cs. And if I want to know, for example, if an insulin pump is working better than another insulin pump, I personally want to see research based on people with values like 5 or 4.8 as A1C. And then I will be able to judge if an insulin pump is working correctly. But in the research that they are mostly doing is looking at those people that are starting on insulin pens and have A1Cs of, say, 8. And then they will transfer them to using insulin pumps, and their A1Cs will be, say, 6. So very good results. And of course, they should go on insulin pumps. And they will be using these automatic softwares, this what they call looping, the systems that gets continuous feedback from the glucose monitor and then automatically adjust the insulin. Then their glucose control might go to 5.9 or so, or from 6.3 to 5.9, that sort of numbers. For me personally, again, that's not enough, because if I would use this system, so they are even more involved systems, but let's maybe get to that later. If I use that system, I'm actually getting worse results. So before I did all this dieting already, my A1C was already always below 5.5. So even on the high carb diet, when I went low carb, it went to, say, 5.2, and with using insulin pens, doing everything manually, I get very good controls. But if I switch to this automatic software, there is a massive time delay. So the software, well, it has to deal with the 15 minutes of time delay in the glucose monitor on all the uncertainties. It cannot work around it. And basically means that it's responding to large fluctuations still and way too late. So I'm getting results on that.
Yeah, I'd also now that you're eating this way, I'd also be worried that kind of it's safer to trust yourself.
Yeah,
It's safer to, it just putting all your eggs in a basket that assumes that everyone's on a high carbohydrate diet, etc., just seems a little bit scary to me.
yeah, and they're making the
Yeah.
same mistake like when they do research about cholesterol, because they are comparing, well, they are using as a reference people that are already on high carb diets, that are already eating seed oils, and that's their standard. That are healthy people, basically, and with lab results, the same story. And with A1Cs as well. If my A1C was, if it were a 6, my doctor would be very happy, because it's very much in the reference range of of even healthy people. Healthy, of course, with quotes. But so if I would go to this automatic systems, my results are really bad. So even if these systems would have AI in it, if it would be automatically learning, because to some degree those systems are able to do that, it is not able to to deal with those technical limitations, because you would need an artificial pancreas inside your body that's directly located in your bloodstream, and of course you will have to deal with all the immune reactions and that sort of things. Basically, in the same way as doing a transplantation of a truly organic organ, and that doesn't work. And there are even more advanced systems. They call it more advanced, so more software variables actually. There's one system that also is able to inject glucagon in the subcutaneous tissue, so it's able to deal with low sugar values as well. So it will just inject insulin, and if it goes too low, then it will switch to glucagon injection. Of course, that gives a little bit more control. It avoids severe hypoglycemic episodes, but it has all these same issues. So, and that's a funny thing. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I already read. I was up to date with most of the research, but still outside the keto carnivore space. But there was research on this device, and it sounded very nice. I was even thinking like, okay, I work a lot with software. I'm programming software, so maybe why not get a job there even at that company? Because that's a nice thing. I would really love to use this device. Well, why not work on it? That's even better. Now I realize that this is never going to be a solution, and there are a lot of other researches being done that are not true solutions, especially in type 2 diabetes. I mean, nowadays they are still looking at ways to deal with something that is, I think, in 99% of cases is effectively not a disease. Because I like what Bart, I think it's Bart K, he mentioned that as well. He's basically saying that your body is still responding exactly in the way it should be doing. Because if you're eating too many sugar, too many carbohydrates, your body has to deal with the amount of sugar getting in, and if then the buildup of well, it's of course converted into fat and stored as fat in the end. But all in all, it's an energy surplus in your body, and at some point your body cannot accept the energy anymore, and you will have to massively increase the amount of insulin to still push more energy into your body cells. That makes sense. And, yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm dying to ask you, what was the point that you went? We kind of left off at keto before. So, what was the point that you kind of went, you know what? I'm totally done with the carbohydrate. I'm just eating meat and eggs from now on.
Yeah, that was a very gradual way, and that's maybe funny to tell. Actually, I had episodes before even starting low carb that I was so frustrated about the results I was getting that at moments I would go to the kitchen and get rid of all the carbohydrates. So without knowing about carnivore keto, I already did that. But then, of course, I only did that for a few days or maybe 1 week. And I would see very good glucose control. And in the same way, I would skip a meal. Because obviously, if you don't have to eat and inject insulin, your glucose control is just perfect. You will have a basal rate of insulin, and that's very constant, so you don't have to think about it. And yeah, that was solved with low carb. But the reason for going to carnivore in the end was very different. I went on a keto diet initially, but I went on keto diet following the ideas of Dr. Berg. which I like very much his channel. He helped a lot. So a lot of details which are most of the times, I think, very accurate as well. So about vitamins and that sort of things. So it was very useful. And also, well, he is a keto doctor, so he helped a lot in that respect as well. But he's following a healthy keto approach based on a lot of vegetables, and I also started doing that. Well, now I can laugh about it, but I had all these troubles that were probably because of oxalate overdose. And also before I started keto, I ate a lot of these oxalate-rich foods. So I would typically crave peanut butter, and on a day I could easily eat up an entire peanut butter jar of say 200 or even 300 grams of peanut butter, or eating nuts and that sort of things. So I think my body was already full of oxalate. And on this keto diet, I was adding even more vegetables. I was also juicing a little bit, luckily not for months in a row. But all these things started to show up also in various symptoms. So if I would be running for, say, half an hour or 1 hour, then afterwards, some of the times I had blood in my urine. Or I would have even brown urine, and that's very scary, of course. But they refer to that as a runner's bladder. Apparently, it happens more. So it's not necessarily critical. So it can be quite benign in the end. But yeah, of course, I went to doctors and wanted to investigate what was happening. I also started to have cloudy urine, and they did measurements on that, and they could not determine anything wrong, and they were not able, with the research that they did, to determine the exact substance. But I'm quite sure it was oxalates, because it always happened after meals. So and it started to gradually reduce. So going forward in time, when I went away from vegetable-rich diet, after several months, it was gone, this effect. But it was very scary in the beginning, and I had to do things like ultrasound tests as well to look at kidneys and the bladder and all these things. They never found something, no residues in the organs or stones or that sort of things. But I think it must have been oxalates, and I also started feeling much better when I reduced the vegetables, and that went in a very gradual way. So at some point, well, I also thought it was good to further reduce carbohydrates, because why not? Reduce it further and your glucose control can get only better. I mean, probably, and that's what happened. So I went to, say, 20 grams, 10 grams of carbs per day, and then I ended up with eating only an avocado sometimes. And I don't think they caused true troubles anymore, because they are fruits in the end. And fruits are better in terms of not having too many anti-nutrients. But then, yeah, I was eating avocados, and they are expensive, and they also they are only really taste nice in summer here, I think. You get a lot of times bad avocados. They look nice on the outside, and then you have these brown ones, and you spend, I don't know, nowadays €1.5 to say $2 per piece. So I thought, what the heck, let's get rid of those as well. I basically stopped buying them, and I think at that point I was carnivore.
And so this is around when? So this is still in 2022?
Yeah, end of the year.
Uh-huh.
At Christmas, with family, I remember that they still placed a plate with some carrots, cucumber, and avocado on the table, and I still ate them. But half a month later or so, I didn't buy it anymore at the supermarket, and maybe 1 or 2 times. But then I think it's also not interesting to talk in that way. Maybe 1 or 2 times I still ate a thing, but I was basically carnivore, and just in the same way that maybe a few weeks ago, for one time I bought some berries, but yeah, that's really the occasional exception. But not yeah, mostly beef.
How has your family reacted to this? Are they like, this is crazy. What are you doing? Or are they kind of, okay, it's great. You're controlling things. We're happy with that.
Yeah, so they were very cautious. So in the first phase, I was doing this Bernstein approach, so with 50 grams of carbs. And they had this idea a little bit more than me personally, that, well, stay on the safe side, don't reduce your carbs too much. And when I went further than that, so already with keto, going to 10 grams per day, you feel a bit more hesitation. And with carnivore, it took several months, I think. But people now also start to notice that I'm looking more healthy, and I was not overweight or anything, and I was not looking unhealthy, but still you get a lot of improvements. I think already one thing that was also improving a lot for me personally was the skin. I would always have spots, and I don't know what it was exactly, acne or anything, but also spots that would easily convert into wounds and that sort of things, and you would accidentally touch something somewhere, even without realizing, and you would look at your hands and there would even be some blood on it, for example. That sort of stuff. So ugly stuff. And that was all gone. And yeah, if you're looking at it in the long term, you start to realize all kinds of things. Then you look at your nails; they are better. Because I would have these, I don't know how you call these edges around the nails, but they would always be damaged and that sort of things. That's not happening anymore. My hands were also full of basically of small wounds, or if I would, in the past, I thought that, well, I think for a large part it was true. If I would be eating gluten, I would get these small blisters. Not in an extreme way, but it was always there, and always on the hands and the face. So it's actually on the visible areas of your body. So that's quite annoying, because if you would come across somebody in the elevator, sometimes if they are a bit direct persons, they would basically ask like, "Oh, what's happening with you?" And I mean, personally, I would be hesitant to ask these questions, but I also like this sometimes. Dutch people are quite direct, so it can be also very useful. If you say that you have a bad breath or so, then there is always this Dutch person that will actually mention it to you, and that can be actually helpful, because at least in the long term you can solve the problem. But yeah, with these skin issues, yeah, I had no idea. It could be coming from everywhere, and doctors would also basically have no clue. And I think if I would go to a dermatologist, they would prescribe how these creams with
put a steroid cream on it.
Yeah, indeed.
And steroid creams fix everything.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean that's the same story again. That we are dealing with all kinds of troubles, and we are doing the same in the world with agriculture. We're depleting the lands, and what we are doing, we are not solving the issue. We're not doing. We're not stopping with monocropping, but we are just putting more. Well, I compare it with the insulin. Let's say we are putting more of these artificial nutrients. We are also putting a lot of medicine on it, so all the pesticides, and we're doing the same in the human body. And yeah, luckily I didn't go for those things, so I actually never visited a dermatologist because I already suspected, based on all the doctor visits that I did in the past, because I had a history of also 20 years leading up to type 1 diabetes, where I did a lot of doctor visits. I had a colonoscopy, and I had, at some point when I was about 20 years old, I had a photo of my lungs to see if there was maybe a reason for feeling so tired all the time, all kinds of things. And it didn't result in anything. And I only found results with some personal solutions. So going gluten-free helped a lot, because I think you are omitting a lot of anti-nutrients, and so that helped for, say, 5 or 10 years, and I stayed on it for, I think, 10 to 12 years in the end. And I took several other measures based on personal experience in the end, and no official so there was no official test for gluten, for example, but yeah, I looked at what it was doing to my body. And although doctors were not saying anything about these things, it helped a lot. And it's just the same with this low carb approach. So I think otherwise, at some point, if I would be continuing with standard diet and not doing all these modifications that I did, at some point I would also be on medicine for all the consequences of type 1 diabetes. Because, for example, gastroparesis, I think I had the very first symptoms of that as well. And in the beginning of my diabetes, it was very easy because my digestion was very predictable. So it was much easier to control sugar levels. Also because in the very first few years, my body would still be producing a little bit of insulin, so that as well. But if you follow standard approach with this carb-rich diet, you get all these, because the control is not perfect, you get all these progressing or regressing things in the diabetes. Things get worse and worse, and your controls of the blood sugars get worse and worse as well, because, well, you're following the same approach as 5 years before. So uncertainties increasing and your control is decreasing.
Let's say someone's watching this interview right now and they've got type 1 diabetes, and they've been frustrated about how much of their life is taken up by, controlling it. What's the advice you would give them?
Low carb. And actually, for type 1 diabetes control itself, I think the approach of Dr. Bernstein is sufficient. So in terms of glucose control, I was there in September 2022. So eat less than 50 grams of carbs per day. And that might be a little bit more if you're very active. It might also be slightly less if you're less active, to simplify matters a bit. But go low carb. And the rest is additional. It's beneficial for general health, I think, but follow your gut feeling literally as well, and you will get good results. Personally, what I like the most is that by having this good glucose control, I got rid of all these frustrating things in life, and getting these additional benefits from carnivore, that is just a shift in attention. So I can now think about the real health aspects. I can do a lot more also to control my health, apart from glucose control. And I also my position, my perspective changed a little bit. So I'm a bit more relaxed now on the glucose control in a way, because I think I could. I in the past I would prefer like flatline approach. So perfect blood glucose control would be also the best for my health. But now since carnivore, I'm seeing all these other aspects of health that play a role, and apparently this diet is doing a lot to my body. So my body composition is better. It's even if my weight is, so I'm actually increasing, I'm gaining more weight currently on the carnivore diet, and that's luckily it's mostly muscle. But even when going on higher weight, I'm feeling much better, and there's still a lot of variation. So on carnivore, you can also still say overeat, or if you eat a lot of fat, you will in the end still also gain weight. But when it happens to me, I'm still feeling all right. And if I'm not exercising, let's say I'm still having my walk, of course, but if I'm not doing intense exercise or very frequent exercise, I'm still feeling all right. And my fat percentage might be a little bit higher at some points during the year, but I'm still feeling fine. And that was not the case in September 2022, because I'm doing a lot of cycling, and in summer I would do that on high carb diet. Cyclists eat a lot of carbohydrates. They would eat even 60 to 100 grams of carbs per hour if they are on the bike. And I could do that as well as a type 1 diabetic, because as long as this engine is running, I think in theory could drink a complete bottle of Coke, of regular Coke. As long as I'm cycling, it would vanish uh, without using too much insulin injections. So cycling is like a liberation of type 1 diabetes, basically, but only when you're actually sitting on the bike, because if you get off for a coffee break, you would have to inject a lot of insulin and still get very high spikes, because your body suddenly stops moving, and there is a lot of energy flowing in your system that eventually leads to these high blood glucose levels again. In the end, it might work a little bit, doing a lot of exercise and high carb dieting with type 1 diabetes, but you're having a lot of variation during the day and during the year, because, well, if then winter season comes, then you have to adjust for it, because your body is still craving food, because you're used to it. And so I would have this as well. And say in September 2022, when it started raining again and getting colder, I would still be eating a lot of bread. And I noticed during that month before starting keto that I was basically developing type 2 diabetes, because suddenly I'm not doing all this sports, and I was still eating a lot of food, so I was gaining weight. But in this case, it was still on carbs, so I would be gaining a lot of fat. And that's the nice thing of type 1 diabetes, at least, is that you immediately see how it affects your insulin sensitivity, because you have to inject more. And so in that sense, I would wish for everybody to be type 1 diabetic for, say, 1 or 2 weeks at least. You will learn a lot about your body. So I've been using these glucose monitors already for 5 years, I think. So I knew a lot about how typical blood glucose levels would change after a meal and that sort of things. And not only there, but also on the insulin side, you gain a lot of insights in how the human body works. So that's I think a very interesting aspect. So in that sense, I also wish for a lot of connections being built between carnivore and type 1 communities, and they exist already, but they are not always well known.
Speaking of that, do you have a YouTube or an Instagram or something like that where people can reach out to you?
Yes, so I do have those. But actively, I'm only using the YouTube in the sense that I am participating in chats and commenting. I'm planning to make some videos myself. I've been very busy lately with work, so I'm trying to set up a channel, and I have no idea when this video will be released. Maybe around that time I might have made a video, maybe not. It's called Dutch Carnivore, and I called it like this because I realized that if I look here in the Netherlands, it's not very well known yet, the diet. So if the Netherlands has 15 million, no, 17 million inhabitants, I'd say there are, well, judging from what I see online, a few thousand at most of carnivores, which maybe percentually is still similar to US. I have no idea, but to my feeling, at least, if you look around, you find very few sources on carnivore diets. And yeah, I like to let people in the Netherlands know about it as well. But it's still called Dutch Carnivore in English, so I will be talking English as well.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your journey with us. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you as well. I liked it very much. Thanks for giving this opportunity.